Captain Marcus Rodriguez had been fighting for 3 years to get his wings back. 3 years since Colonel Bradley Thompson had destroyed his career with a single lie. 3 years of being relegated to ground crew duty at Edwards Air Force Base, watching other pilots soar through the California sky while he remained earthbound, his dreams shattered by one man's jealousy and abuse of power. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in March 2019. Marcus had been one of the Air Force's most promising F-22 Raptor pilots, with over 500 flight hours and a spotless record. He was being considered for promotion to major and assignment to an elite squadron when Colonel Thompson arrived as the new wing commander. Thompson was a political appointee, a man who had spent more time behind a desk than in a cockpit, yet he wielded his authority like a weapon against anyone he perceived as a threat. Marcus remembered the day clearly. He had just completed a flawless training mission, executing complex maneuvers that had impressed his instructors. As he walked back to the debriefing room, still wearing his flight suit and carrying his helmet, he overheard Thompson talking to another officer about budget cuts and pilot reassignments. What Marcus heard made his blood run cold. Thompson was discussing falsifying pilot performance reports to justify removing certain officers from flight status. Marcus was specifically mentioned as someone who needed to be brought down a peg because he was too popular with the enlisted men and questioned authority too much. The colonel's voice was casual, almost bored, as he discussed destroying careers and dreams as if they were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. Marcus knew he should have walked away, should have pretended he hadn't heard anything, but his conscience wouldn't let him. That evening, he filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General's office, detailing what he had overheard and providing dates and witnesses. He thought the system would protect him, that truth and justice would prevail. He was wrong. Within a week, Marcus found himself facing a disciplinary hearing. Colonel Thompson had filed charges against him, claiming that Marcus had been insubordinate during a briefing, had questioned direct orders, and had shown a pattern of disrespectful behavior. The charges were fabricated, but Thompson had convinced other officers to support his version of events. Some were afraid of their own careers. Others were simply loyal to the chain of command regardless of the truth. The hearing was a sham. Despite Marcus's clean record and the testimony of several enlisted personnel who spoke to his character, the board sided with Thompson. Marcus was stripped of his flight status pending a full investigation that never seemed to materialize. He was reassigned to ground maintenance duties, effectively ending his career as a pilot. The investigation into Thompson's alleged misconduct was quietly closed after a few months. No evidence of wrongdoing was found, the report stated. Marcus's complaint was dismissed as the bitter accusations of a disgruntled officer who couldn't accept discipline. His appeals were denied, his requests for transfer rejected. He was trapped at Edwards, watching his dreams die a slow death while the man who had destroyed him continued to rise through the ranks. For 3 years, Marcus endured the humiliation. He worked on the flight line, servicing the same F-22s he had once piloted with skill and pride. Every day, he watched other pilots take to the skis, their contrails marking paths through the desert air that he was forbidden to follow. The other ground crew members treated him with a mixture of sympathy and embarrassment, knowing his story but unable to help. Thompson seemed to take pleasure in Marcus's fall from grace. He would often walk past the maintenance hangar, making pointed comments about former pilots and the importance of knowing one's place. He assigned Marcus to the most menial tasks, ensuring that the man who had once been among the Air Force's elite was now scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans. It was psychological warfare, designed to break Marcus's spirit and force him to resign. But Marcus refused to quit. He had a family to support, a wife and 2 young daughters who depended on him. More importantly, he had a burning desire for justice that kept him going even in his darkest moments. He continued to file appeals, to write letters to senators and congressmen, to seek any avenue that might restore his flight status. Every request was denied, every letter ignored or dismissed with form responses. The breaking point came on a humid August morning in 2022. Marcus was working on routine maintenance on an F-22 when he overheard a conversation between 2 pilots discussing a recent incident. One of them mentioned how Colonel Thompson had been bragging at the officers' club about crushing that hotshot Rodriguez, and how he had made sure that troublemaker would never fly again. The pilot seemed uncomfortable sharing the story, but his companion laughed and said it was probably for the best, that pilots who couldn't follow orders were dangerous. Marcus felt something snap inside him. For 3 years he had played by the rules, had trusted in the system, had believed that eventually justice would prevail. But the system was broken, corrupted by men like Thompson who used their power to destroy lives with impunity. If the official channels wouldn't help him, then he would have to find another way. That night, Marcus sat in his small apartment, staring at the walls covered with photos of his flying days. His wife, Sarah, had taken the girls to visit her mother, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He pulled out his laptop and began researching everything he could about Colonel Thompson's career, his connections, his weaknesses. If he was going to fight back, he needed to understand his enemy. What he discovered was disturbing. Thompson's rise through the ranks had been marked by a series of incidents involving subordinates who had been disciplined or forced out of the service. There was a pattern of behavior, a trail of destroyed careers and ruined lives that stretched back years. Marcus wasn't Thompson's first victim, and he wouldn't be the last unless someone stopped him. The research also revealed something else. Thompson was a coward. Despite his high rank and position of authority, he had never seen actual combat. His decorations were administrative, his promotions political. He had built his career on the backs of better men and women, using his position to eliminate threats and advance his own interests. The knowledge filled Marcus with a cold fury that went beyond personal revenge. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to formulate a plan. It was risky, potentially career-ending, but he had already lost his career. What he hadn't lost was his skill as a pilot, his knowledge of the F-22 systems, and his access to the aircraft he serviced every day. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and completely against regulations. It was also the only way he could think of to expose Thompson's corruption to the world. The F-22 Raptor was one of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, a fifth-generation stealth fighter capable of incredible maneuvers and speeds. Marcus had logged hundreds of hours in the aircraft, knew its systems like the back of his hand. More importantly, he still had his security clearance, still had access to the flight line, still had the trust of the ground crew who remembered him as one of their own. The opportunity came on a Friday afternoon in September. A training exercise had been scheduled for the weekend, with multiple F-22s prepared for flight. The pilots were in briefings. The control tower was focused on other aircraft, and security was relaxed in the familiar environment of the training schedule. Marcus had been assigned to perform final checks on one of the aircraft, a routine task that would put him alone with the fighter for nearly an hour. As he worked through the checklist, Marcus's heart pounded with anticipation and fear. What he was about to do would change everything, would force the Air Force to confront Thompson's corruption in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up. He thought about his daughters, about the other pilots whose careers had been destroyed, about the future officers who would suffer under Thompson's command if nothing was done. The aircraft was fully fueled and armed with training munitions. All systems were green, all safety checks complete. Marcus looked around the hangar, making sure he was alone, then climbed into the cockpit. His hands moved automatically through the startup sequence, muscle memory taking over as the powerful engines spooled up and the aircraft systems came online. The control tower's first indication that something was wrong came when they received an unscheduled takeoff request from an F-22 that wasn't supposed to be flying. The pilot identified himself using Marcus's old call sign, one that hadn't been used in 3 years. Before the tower could respond, the aircraft was already taxiing toward the runway, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Colonel Thompson was in his office, reviewing reports and planning his next political move, when the first call came in. His aide rushed in, face pale with panic, stammering about an unauthorized takeoff and a rogue pilot. Thompson's first thought was that it was some kind of training exercise he hadn't been informed about, but as the details became clear, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The F-22 was airborne now, climbing rapidly into the clear desert sky. In the cockpit, Marcus felt a surge of joy and freedom that he hadn't experienced in 3 years. The aircraft responded to his touch like a living thing, powerful and graceful, carrying him away from the base and toward the confrontation he had been planning for months. But this was just the beginning. What Marcus did next would shock the entire Air Force and expose the corruption that had been hidden for too long. As the F-22 reached altitude and began its first maneuver, people on the ground started to realize that whoever was in that cockpit was about to make a statement that would be heard around the world. The aircraft banked sharply, beginning a series of aerobatic maneuvers that were definitely not part of any approved training exercise. On the ground, sirens began to wail as the base went into emergency mode. Colonel Thompson stood at his office window, watching the F-22 perform impossible-looking maneuvers against the blue sky, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly afraid. Marcus Rodriguez was no longer the broken man who had been scrubbing toilets and emptying trash cans. He was a pilot again, in command of one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, and he was about to show everyone exactly what Colonel Thompson had tried to destroy. The real confrontation was just beginning. Air traffic control was in chaos. The duty officer, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had been tracking routine training flights when the unauthorized F-22 appeared on her screen. She immediately tried to establish radio contact, broadcasting on all emergency frequencies, but the aircraft maintained radio silence. The pilot, whoever they were, was clearly skilled, executing precise maneuvers that demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the F-22's capabilities. Unknown aircraft, this is Edwards Tower. You are in violation of controlled airspace. Identify yourself immediately and return to base, Walsh broadcasted, her voice steady despite the growing panic in the control room. The response was silence, broken only by the sound of the F-22's engines as it continued its aerial display. Colonel Thompson had rushed to the control tower, his face flushed with anger and fear. He pushed past the other officers, grabbing the microphone from Captain Walsh. "This is Colonel Thompson, Wing Commander. I order you to identify yourself and return to base immediately. This is a direct order from your commanding officer." The response, when it finally came, sent a chill through everyone in the tower. The voice was calm, measured, and filled with a quiet determination that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. "Hello, Colonel. This is Captain Marcus Rodriguez. I believe you remember me." Thompson's face went white. The microphone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor as he stared at the radar screen showing the F-22's position. Around him, the other officers exchanged glances, some beginning to understand the significance of the name that had just been spoken. "I've been waiting 3 years for this conversation, Colonel," Marcus continued, his voice coming clearly through the radio. "3 years since you destroyed my career with your lies. 3 years of watching you abuse your power while I cleaned the toilets you thought I belonged in. But I haven't been idle during those years. I've been preparing for this moment." The F-22 suddenly rolled inverted, flying upside down at 300 feet above the base. The maneuver was flawless, a demonstration of skill that left no doubt about the pilot's capabilities. Personnel on the ground stopped what they were doing, looking up at the aircraft with a mixture of awe and terror. "You see, Colonel, the thing about destroying someone's career is that you better make sure you finish the job. Because if you don't, if you leave them with nothing to lose, they might just decide to take everything from you instead." Thompson found his voice, grabbing another microphone. "Rodriguez, you're making a huge mistake. Land that aircraft immediately and we can work this out. I'll recommend leniency, but only if you surrender now." Marcus's laughter came through the radio, cold and bitter. "Leniency? From you? The same leniency you showed me during that sham hearing. The same leniency you've shown to all the other pilots whose careers you've destroyed. I don't think so, Colonel." The F-22 pulled out of its inverted flight, climbing rapidly before executing a perfect barrel roll directly over the command building. The sound of the engines was deafening, rattling windows and setting off car alarms across the base. It was a display of precision and power that left no doubt about the pilot's intentions. "I've done my research, Colonel. I know about Captain Williams, who you had transferred to Alaska after he questioned your safety protocols. I know about Lieutenant Martinez, who you had court-martialed for insubordination after she reported your inappropriate behavior. I know about Master Sergeant Peterson, who you had demoted for refusing to falsify maintenance records. Should I continue?" In the control tower, several officers were taking notes, recording everything that was being said. Thompson realized that his crimes were being broadcast not just to the base, but to every aircraft in the area, every control tower within radio range. The conversation was being recorded, documented, and would soon be evidence in an investigation he couldn't control or manipulate. "You have no proof of any of that," Thompson said, but his voice lacked conviction. "These are the desperate accusations of a man who's lost his mind. Everyone can see that you're mentally unstable." "Am I?" Marcus asked. "Then explain this." The F-22 suddenly dove toward the base, pulling up at the last second to fly low over the runway. As it passed, something fell from the aircraft, fluttering in the wind before landing on the tarmac. Ground crews rushed to retrieve it, finding a sealed envelope marked for the Inspector General. That envelope contains copies of documents I've been collecting for 3 years, Marcus announced. Financial records showing how you've been skimming from the base budget. Performance reports with your signature that contradict earlier versions. Email correspondence with your political allies discussing how to eliminate troublesome officers. And sworn statements from witnesses who were too afraid to speak up before but are ready to testify now. The blood drained from Thompson's face. He had been careful, had covered his tracks, but apparently not carefully enough. The realization that his corruption was about to be exposed filled him with a panic that made it hard to breathe. "You're bluffing," he said, but everyone in the tower could hear the fear in his voice. "Am I? Well, let's find out. Because that envelope is just the beginning. I've sent copies to every major news outlet, every senator on the Armed Services Committee, and every general in the Air Force chain of command. By tomorrow morning, your face will be on the front page of every newspaper in the country." The F-22 pulled into a steep climb, disappearing into the clouds before emerging in a perfect split-test maneuver that brought it back over the base. The skill required for such precision flying was extraordinary, a reminder that Marcus Rodriguez was not just any pilot, but one of the best the Air Force had ever produced. "The question now, Colonel, is what you're going to do about it. Are you going to continue lying, continue denying, continue trying to destroy the lives of good people? Or are you going to finally face the consequences of your actions?" Thompson grabbed the microphone again, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll have you court-martialed for this. I'll have you thrown in prison. You'll never fly again." "I already haven't flown in 3 years, thanks to you," Marcus replied calmly. "But today, I'm flying again. And everyone can see that you didn't take my wings away because I was a bad pilot. You took them away because you were afraid of what would happen if I told the truth about you." The F-22 began a series of complex maneuvers, each one more impressive than the last. Knife-edge passes, vertical climbs, and rolling scissor maneuvers that showcased the aircraft's capabilities and the pilot's skill. It was a demonstration that would have been impressive at any air show, but here, in this context, it was something more. It was a declaration of war. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to every radio in the area, "what you're witnessing today is what happens when the system fails. When good people try to do the right thing and are punished for it. When corrupt officers abuse their power and destroy lives with impunity. When the chain of command protects the guilty and persecutes the innocent." The aircraft rolled inverted again, this time flying directly over the command building at an altitude that seemed impossibly low. The roar of the engines was deafening, and several officers in the tower instinctively ducked as the massive fighter passed overhead. "I've spent 3 years trying to work within the system," Marcus continued. "3 years of appeals and requests and letters to congressmen. 3 years of watching Colonel Thompson continue to abuse his power while I was relegated to cleaning toilets. But the system is broken, corrupted by men like him who use their rank to serve themselves instead of their country." Thompson was frantically making phone calls, trying to contact his superiors, trying to control the narrative. But it was too late. The story was already spreading, already beyond his ability to suppress or spin. Social media was lighting up with reports of the rogue F-22, and news helicopters were already scrambling to cover the story. "So today, I'm taking matters into my own hands," Marcus announced. "Today, I'm showing the world what Colonel Thompson tried to destroy. Today, I'm proving that I'm still the pilot I always was, that my skills were never the problem. The problem was a corrupt system that rewards liars and punishes truth-tellers." The F-22 pulled up from its low pass, climbing rapidly before executing a perfect hammerhead turn that brought it back toward the base. The maneuver was flawless, a display of aeronautical skill that left no doubt about the pilot's capabilities. "I want everyone to understand something," Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone listen. "I'm not doing this for revenge, although I won't lie and say that's not part of it. I'm doing this because there are other pilots out there, other good people who are being destroyed by corrupt officers like Colonel Thompson. I'm doing this because someone has to stand up and say enough." In the control tower, Captain Walsh was coordinating with approach control, trying to manage the chaos as news helicopters and other aircraft converged on the area. The situation was unprecedented, and standard procedures didn't cover rogue fighter pilots making political statements while performing unauthorized aerobatics. "The truth is going to come out," Marcus continued. "All of it. Every lie, every cover-up, every career destroyed to protect Colonel Thompson's reputation. And when it does, I want everyone to remember this moment. I want everyone to remember that sometimes, when the system fails, good people have to take extraordinary measures to make things right." The F-22 began another series of maneuvers, each one more aggressive than the last. The aircraft seemed to defy gravity, turning and rolling and climbing in ways that pushed the limits of both machine and pilot. It was a display of pure skill and determination, a reminder of what the Air Force had lost when it grounded Marcus Rodriguez. Thompson was screaming into his phone now, demanding that someone scramble interceptors, that someone shoot down the rogue aircraft. But his superiors weren't listening. They were too busy trying to understand what was happening, trying to figure out how to contain the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. "I know what you're thinking," Marcus said, as if he could hear Thompson's frantic phone calls. "You're thinking about scrambling other aircraft, about forcing me down. But let me save you the trouble. I'm not running from this. I'm not trying to escape. I'm here to make a point, and when I'm done making it, I'll come down on my own terms." The F-22 rolled inverted one more time, flying upside down at an altitude that seemed to skim the tops of the base buildings. The maneuver was so precise, so controlled, that it left no doubt about the pilot's intentions. This wasn't the action of a madman or a terrorist. This was the carefully planned demonstration of a man who had been pushed too far. "But first," Marcus announced, "I think it's time for Colonel Thompson to explain to everyone exactly why he destroyed my career. I think it's time for him to tell the truth about what he's done to me and to all the other good people he's hurt over the years." The aircraft pulled out of its inverted flight, climbing rapidly as it prepared for what would be the most dramatic moment of the entire confrontation. On the ground, thousands of people were watching, filming, broadcasting the event to the world. The rogue F-22 had become a symbol, a focal point for everyone who had ever been wronged by a corrupt system. And in the cockpit, Marcus Rodriguez smiled grimly as he prepared to make his final point. The real show was just beginning, and by the time it was over, Colonel Thompson's career would be as destroyed as Marcus's had been 3 years ago. The difference was that Thompson deserved it. The F-22 reached the apex of its climb, hanging motionless in the sky for a moment before beginning its descent. What happened next would be talked about for years, would become the stuff of legend among pilots and aviation enthusiasts. But more importantly, it would be the moment when justice finally caught up with Colonel Bradley Thompson. The aircraft began to descend, building speed as it dove toward the base. To the observers on the ground, it looked like Marcus was going to crash, was going to end his demonstration in a blaze of glory that would make him a martyr for his cause. But those who knew him, who understood his skill and determination, knew better. Marcus Rodriguez had spent 3 years planning this moment, 3 years preparing for this confrontation. He wasn't going to throw his life away in a meaningless gesture. He was going to make a statement that would resonate for years to come, that would expose the corruption at the heart of the system and restore his reputation in the most dramatic way possible. The F-22 pulled out of its dive at the last second, leveling off just 50 feet above the runway. The aircraft was moving at incredible speed, its engines screaming as it shot across the base like a silver bullet. And then, just as it seemed like it might disappear into the distance, Marcus executed the maneuver that would be remembered forever. The F-22 pulled up sharply, climbing vertically before rolling inverted at the exact moment it passed over the command building. The maneuver was perfect, a display of precision and control that left everyone speechless. But it was more than just a display of skill. It was a statement, a declaration that Marcus Rodriguez was still the pilot he had always been, that Colonel Thompson's efforts to destroy him had failed. As the aircraft completed its roll and leveled off, Marcus's voice came through the radio one final time. "Colonel Thompson, your career is over. The truth is out there now, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. You destroyed my life, but I'm still here. I'm still flying. And I'm still the pilot you were so afraid of." The F-22 banked sharply, beginning its final approach to the runway. The demonstration was over. The point had been made, and now it was time to face the consequences. But Marcus Rodriguez was no longer the broken man who had been relegated to cleaning toilets. He was a pilot again, a warrior who had fought back against corruption and won. As the aircraft touched down and rolled to a stop, emergency vehicles surrounded it. Marcus shut down the engines and opened the canopy, raising his hands to show that he was unarmed. He had known this moment would come, had prepared for it, and he was ready to accept whatever came next. But as he climbed out of the cockpit, he could see the faces of the ground crew who had surrounded the aircraft. They weren't looking at him with anger or fear. They were looking at him with admiration, with respect, with the knowledge that he had done something extraordinary. He had stood up to corruption and won, had exposed the truth in a way that couldn't be ignored or covered up. Colonel Thompson was finished. The documents Marcus had prepared, the evidence he had collected, the dramatic demonstration he had just completed, all of it would be investigated, all of it would be scrutinized, and all of it would lead to the downfall of a corrupt officer who had abused his power for too long. As the military police approached, Marcus Rodriguez stood tall and proud. He had gotten his revenge, had restored his reputation, and had ensured that Colonel Thompson would never hurt another pilot again. The unauthorized flight had been worth it, had been necessary, and had been the only way to make things right. The aftermath of the incident was swift and decisive. Within hours, Colonel Thompson was relieved of his command and placed under investigation. Within days, the evidence Marcus had collected was being reviewed by the highest levels of the Air Force command structure. And within weeks, the entire scandal was front-page news across the country. Marcus Rodriguez had gotten his wings back in the most dramatic way possible. He had shown the world that sometimes, when the system fails, good people have to take extraordinary measures to make things right. And in doing so, he had become a hero to everyone who had ever been wronged by a corrupt system. The F-22 had rolled inverted over the base, and everyone had finally learned who was in the cockpit. It was a pilot who refused to be broken, a man who had fought back against corruption and won. And his story would be told for generations to come, a reminder that sometimes The only way to defeat injustice is to take to the skis and show the world what truth looks like. Marcus Rodriguez was taken into custody immediately after landing, but his treatment was far different from what Colonel Thompson had expected. The military police who arrested him were respectful, almost deferential, as they processed him. Word of his dramatic flight had spread throughout the base, and many of the enlisted personnel and junior officers viewed him as a hero who had finally exposed the corruption they had witnessed for years. The interrogation began within hours, conducted by investigators from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. Marcus had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed his answers, and had organized his evidence in a way that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He sat calmly in the small interview room, his hands folded on the table, as the investigators reviewed the documents he had dropped during his flight. Captain Rodriguez, the lead investigator, Colonel Sarah Mitchell, began. "You understand that you've committed several serious crimes today. Unauthorized use of military aircraft, endangering personnel, disobeying direct orders. These are court-martial offenses that could result in decades in prison." Marcus nodded calmly. "I understand the charges, Colonel. I also understand that sometimes doing the right thing requires breaking unjust rules. I've spent 3 years trying to work within the system, and the system failed me. Today, I made sure the system couldn't fail anyone else." Colonel Mitchell spread out copies of the documents from Marcus's envelope. "These are serious allegations against Colonel Thompson. Financial irregularities, abuse of authority, falsifying official records. If these are true, they represent a pattern of corruption that goes back years." "They're not allegations, Colonel. They're facts. I've spent 3 years collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and documenting every crime Colonel Thompson has committed. I have bank records, email correspondence, witness statements, and official documents that prove everything I've said." The interrogation continued for hours, with Marcus providing detailed explanations for every piece of evidence he had collected. He had been methodical in his investigation, had built a case that would be impossible to dismiss. The investigators were impressed despite themselves, recognizing that Marcus had done the work that they should have done years ago. Meanwhile, Colonel Thompson was facing his own interrogation. The evidence Marcus had provided was being corroborated by other witnesses, and the financial irregularities were being investigated by military auditors. Thompson's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, his lies being exposed one by one. The media coverage was intense and immediate. News of the rogue F-22 had spread across social media within minutes of the incident, and by evening, every major news outlet was covering the story. The dramatic footage of the F-22's aerobatic display was being broadcast around the world, and Marcus Rodriguez was becoming a household name. The Air Force brass was in crisis mode. The unauthorized flight was an embarrassment, a security breach that raised questions about base security and pilot screening procedures. But the evidence of corruption Marcus had provided was even more damaging, threatening to expose systemic problems that went far beyond one corrupt colonel. 3 days after the incident, Marcus was released from custody pending a full investigation. The charges against him hadn't been dropped, but the growing evidence of Thompson's corruption was changing the narrative. Public opinion was solidly behind Marcus, with veterans groups and civil rights organizations calling for his exoneration. The investigation into Thompson's activities moved quickly. The financial audit revealed that he had been skimming from the base budget for years, using his position to enrich himself and his political allies. The review of personnel actions showed a clear pattern of retaliation against officers who had questioned his authority or threatened his position. One by one, Thompson's victims came forward. Captain Williams, who had been transferred to Alaska, testified about Thompson's retaliation against him for questioning safety protocols. Lieutenant Martinez, who had been court-martialed for insubordination, revealed that her real crime had been reporting Thompson's inappropriate behavior toward female officers. Master Sergeant Peterson, who had been demoted for refusing to falsify maintenance records, provided documentation of Thompson's attempts to cover up safety violations. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of systematic corruption and abuse of power that had been covered up for years. Thompson's political connections, which had once protected him, were now abandoning him as the scandal grew. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, his legacy one of corruption and abuse. 6 months after the incident, Marcus Rodriguez was vindicated. The charges against him were dropped, and he was reinstated to flight status with full back pay and benefits. The Air Force, recognizing the injustice he had suffered, promoted him to major and assigned him to an elite squadron, the same assignment he had been in line for before Thompson destroyed his career. Colonel Thompson was court-martialed and convicted on multiple charges. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, reduced to the rank of private, and given a dishonorable discharge. His military pension was revoked, and he was ordered to pay restitution for the money he had stolen. The man who had once wielded his authority like a weapon was now a convicted felon, his life as destroyed as the careers he had ruined. The incident had lasting effects throughout the Air Force. New policies were implemented to prevent retaliation against whistleblowers, and the Inspector General's office was reorganized to be more independent and responsive. The culture of silence that had protected corrupt officers like Thompson was being dismantled, replaced by a system that valued truth and accountability. Marcus Rodriguez became a symbol of resistance against corruption, a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing requires extraordinary courage. His story was told in military academies and leadership schools, used as an example of how one person can make a difference by refusing to accept injustice. The F-22 he had flown during his dramatic demonstration was retired from service and placed in the Air Force Museum, a monument to the power of truth and the importance of standing up to corruption. A plaque next to the aircraft told the story of Captain Marcus Rodriguez, the pilot who had rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base and changed the Air Force forever. Years later, Major Marcus Rodriguez would look back on that day as a turning point not just in his own life, but in the life of the Air Force itself. The unauthorized flight had been risky, potentially career-ending, but it had been necessary. Sometimes, he would tell young pilots, the only way to defeat injustice is to take to the skis and show the world what truth looks like. The story of the F-22 that rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base became legend, a tale told and retold in ready rooms and pilot lounges around the world. It was a story of courage and justice, of one man's refusal to accept defeat, and of the power of truth to triumph over corruption. And at the center of it all was Marcus Rodriguez, the pilot who had shown that sometimes, when the system fails, good people have to take extraordinary measures to make things right. The investigation into Colonel Thompson's corruption revealed a network of complicity that extended far beyond Edwards Air Force Base. Other bases, other commanders, other victims, all connected by a web of political favors and career protection that had allowed corruption to flourish unchecked. The Air Force launched a service-wide investigation, determined to root out the systemic problems that had allowed officers like Thompson to abuse their power. Marcus Rodriguez found himself at the center of this investigation, not as a suspect, but as a key witness and reformer. His methodical documentation of Thompson's crimes became a template for investigating other corrupt officers. The techniques he had used to gather evidence, the patience he had shown in building his case, and the courage he had demonstrated in exposing the truth became a model for other whistleblowers. The media attention continued for months, with Marcus becoming a reluctant celebrity. He appeared on news programs and gave interviews to magazines, always emphasizing that his fight had been about more than personal revenge. He spoke eloquently about the responsibility of military officers to serve their country and their subordinates with integrity, about the importance of protecting whistleblowers, and about the need for systemic reform. The Air Force, recognizing the value of Marcus's insights, appointed him to a special commission tasked with reforming the military justice system. His recommendations, based on his personal experience and his extensive research into military corruption, were implemented across all branches of the armed forces. The Marcus Rodriguez Whistleblower Protection Act was passed by Congress, providing legal protections for military personnel who reported corruption and abuse. Thompson's conviction was just the beginning. The investigation he had triggered led to the prosecution of 12 other officers, including 2 generals who had been part of the network that protected corrupt commanders. The scandal rocked the Air Force, leading to the resignation of the Chief of Staff and a complete overhaul of the promotion system. Marcus's family, who had suffered through 3 years of his disgrace and struggled with the financial hardship of his demotion, were finally able to rebuild their lives. His wife, Sarah, had stood by him through the darkest days, believing in his innocence when the rest of the world had written him off. His daughters, who had been too young to understand why their father had been taken away from flying, were now old enough to appreciate his courage and integrity. The restoration of his flight status was more than just a professional victory for Marcus. It was a return to his true calling, a chance to serve his country in the way he had always intended. He threw himself into his new assignment with the passion and dedication that had made him an exceptional pilot in the first place. His new squadron, the 94th Fighter Squadron, welcomed him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Most of the pilots had followed his story in the news, and many viewed him as a hero who had stood up to corruption at great personal cost. The squadron commander, Colonel James Patterson, was a no-nonsense officer who valued competence and integrity above all else. "Rodriguez," Patterson said during their first meeting, "you've been through hell and you've come out the other side with your honor intact. That's something not many men can say. I don't care about the politics or the media circus. I care about whether you can still fly and fight. Can you do that?" Marcus's answer was delivered not with words but with actions. During his first training flight in 3 years, he demonstrated the same skill and precision that had made him one of the Air Force's most promising pilots. The F-22 responded to his touch as if he had never been away, the years of forced inactivity melting away as he pushed the aircraft through its paces. The other pilots in the squadron quickly learned to respect his abilities. Despite the 3-year gap in his flying career, Marcus had kept himself current on all technical developments and tactical innovations. He had spent his time in exile studying, preparing, and staying mentally sharp for the day when he would return to the cockpit. The media attention gradually faded as other stories captured the public's attention, but Marcus's impact on the Air Force continued to grow. Young officers sought him out for advice, seeing him as a role model who had fought the system and won. His story became part of the curriculum at the Air Force Academy, used to teach cadets about the importance of integrity and moral courage. Thompson's trial was a media sensation, with every detail of his corruption being exposed in open court. The prosecution, led by a team of military lawyers who had been inspired by Marcus's example, presented a devastating case that left no doubt about Thompson's guilt. The evidence Marcus had collected was crucial to the conviction, providing the documentary proof needed to support the testimony of Thompson's victims. During the trial, Marcus testified about his own experience, describing in detail how Thompson had destroyed his career and attempted to break his spirit. His testimony was powerful and emotional, bringing tears to the eyes of spectators as he described the 3 years of humiliation and struggle he had endured. But he also spoke about the importance of never giving up, of continuing to fight for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. Thompson was sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed under military law, and his disgrace was complete. The man who had once wielded absolute power over the careers of subordinates was now a convicted felon, his name synonymous with corruption and abuse of authority. Marcus felt a sense of closure as he watched Thompson being led away in shackles, but he also felt a profound sadness. The corruption had been exposed, justice had been served, but the years of his life that had been stolen could never be recovered. The dreams that had been deferred, the opportunities that had been lost, the pain that his family had endured, these were costs that could never be fully repaid. But there were also victories to celebrate. The Air Force had been reformed, the system had been improved, and future generations of officers would be protected from the kind of abuse that Marcus had suffered. The culture of silence that had protected corrupt officers was being replaced by a culture of accountability and transparency. Marcus's own career flourished in the years following his vindication. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, then to full colonel, his record unmarked by the false charges that had once threatened to destroy him. He commanded his own squadron, then his own wing, always leading by example, and always protecting his subordinates from the kind of abuse he had suffered. The F-22 program, which had been tainted by the scandal, was revitalized under new leadership. The aircraft that Marcus had used to expose Thompson's corruption became a symbol of the Air Force's commitment to integrity and excellence. New pilots were trained not just in the technical aspects of flying the F-22, but in the ethical responsibilities that came with wielding such power. Marcus never forgot the lessons he had learned during his 3 years in exile. He established a foundation to help military personnel who had been victims of corruption and abuse, providing legal assistance and financial support to those who lacked the resources to fight back. The foundation, funded by donations from veterans and aviation enthusiasts around the world, became a powerful force for reform within the military. The story of the F-22 that rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base became more than just a tale of personal revenge. It became a symbol of the power of truth, the importance of standing up to corruption, and the responsibility of every service member to protect the integrity of their profession. Marcus Rodriguez had not just won his personal battle against Colonel Thompson. He had won a larger war against the forces of corruption that threatened to undermine the military's mission. Years later, as Marcus looked back on that day, he realized that the unauthorized flight had been the defining moment of his life. It had cost him greatly, had put his career and his freedom at risk, but it had also given him something invaluable: the knowledge that he had done the right thing, that he had stood up for what was right even when it seemed impossible. The F-22 had rolled inverted over the base, and in that moment, everyone had learned who was in the cockpit. It was a pilot who refused to be broken, a man who had fought back against corruption and won. And his legacy would endure long after the last F-22 was retired from service, a reminder that sometimes the only way to defeat injustice is to take to the skis and show the world what courage looks like. Marcus Rodriguez had gotten his wings back, but more importantly, he had restored his honor and helped reform the system that had failed him. The boy who had dreamed of flying had become the man who had shown the world that integrity and courage were more important than rank or position. And in doing so, he had ensured that future generations of pilots would fly in a cleaner, more just Air Force. The unauthorized flight of the F-22 that rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base had changed everything. It had exposed corruption, reformed the military, and created a hero whose story would be told for generations to come. Marcus Rodriguez had taken the ultimate risk and won the ultimate victory, proving that sometimes, when the system fails, good people have to take extraordinary measures to make things right. As Marcus continued to serve his country with distinction, he carried with him the memory of that day when he had rolled inverted over the base and changed the Air Force forever. It was a reminder that courage comes in many forms, that justice sometimes requires dramatic action, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find a way to prevail. The F-22 had rolled inverted, and the world had learned who was in the cockpit. It was Captain Marcus Rodriguez, a pilot who had refused to accept defeat, who had fought back against corruption, and who had shown that sometimes the only way to make things right is to take to the skis and demonstrate what real courage looks like. His story would be remembered long after the last contrail faded from the desert sky, a testament to the power of truth and the importance of never giving up the fight for justice. The ripple effects of Marcus's dramatic flight continued to spread throughout the military and beyond. Congressional hearings were held to investigate the systemic problems that had allowed Thompson's corruption to flourish. The Secretary of Defense issued new directives requiring regular ethics training for all officers and establishing independent oversight committees to investigate allegations of abuse and corruption. Marcus found himself testifying before Congress, his words carrying the weight of personal experience and moral authority. He spoke about the culture of fear that had prevented good people from speaking out, about the political networks that had protected corrupt officers, and about the need for fundamental reform in the military justice system. The military is supposed to be a meritocracy, he told the House Armed Services Committee. It's supposed to be a place where good people can serve their country with honor and integrity. But when corrupt officers like Colonel Thompson are allowed to abuse their power, when the system protects the guilty and punishes the innocent, then we lose the very thing that makes us strong. His testimony was broadcast live on television, and his words resonated with millions of Americans who had served in the military or who had family members in service. The hashtag #FlyForTruth became a rallying cry for military reform, and Marcus's story inspired a new generation of whistleblowers to come forward with their own stories of corruption and abuse. The Air Force Academy revised its curriculum to include extensive training on ethics and moral courage. The story of Marcus Rodriguez became required reading for all cadets, and his example was used to teach the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it comes at great personal cost. The Academy's honor code was strengthened, and new protections were put in place for cadets who reported violations. Thompson's network of corruption was systematically dismantled over the following years. The investigation revealed a web of financial kickbacks, political favors, and career manipulations that had affected hundreds of officers across multiple bases. The scandal led to the largest military corruption prosecution in decades, with dozens of officers convicted and hundreds more disciplined. Marcus's personal life also began to heal. His marriage to Sarah grew stronger as they worked together to rebuild their lives. His daughters, now old enough to understand what their father had been through, were proud of his courage and integrity. The family moved to a new base, where Marcus could serve without the constant reminder of the years he had lost. The Air Force, recognizing the value of Marcus's experience and insights, appointed him to head a new office dedicated to preventing corruption and protecting whistleblowers. It was a position that allowed him to institutionalize the reforms he had fought for, to ensure that future generations of airmen would not suffer the same injustices he had endured. In this new role, Marcus worked tirelessly to change the culture of the Air Force. He traveled to bases around the world, speaking to officers and enlisted personnel about the importance of integrity and the protection of those who reported wrongdoing. His message was simple but powerful. The Air Force belonged to all of its members, and everyone had a responsibility to protect it from corruption. The reforms Marcus championed were not just procedural but cultural. He worked to break down the wall of silence that had protected corrupt officers, to create an environment where reporting wrongdoing was seen as a duty rather than a betrayal. He established hotlines for reporting corruption, created independent investigation teams, and instituted regular integrity assessments for all commands. The impact of these reforms was immediate and dramatic. Reports of corruption increased significantly as personnel felt safe to come forward, but the actual instances of corruption decreased as word spread that the Air Force was serious about enforcing its standards. The culture of accountability that Marcus had fought for was becoming reality. Marcus's story also had an impact beyond the military. His autobiography, Rolling Inverted, a fighter pilot's battle against corruption, became a bestseller, inspiring readers from all walks of life to stand up for what they believed in. The book was translated into dozens of languages and became required reading in business schools and leadership programs around the world. The F-22 that Marcus had flown during his dramatic demonstration was indeed retired to the Air Force Museum, but it was more than just a static display. Interactive exhibits allowed visitors to experience the story of that day, to understand the courage it had taken to expose corruption, and to learn about the reforms that had followed. The exhibit became one of the most popular attractions at the museum, drawing visitors from around the world. Marcus continued to fly throughout his career, but every flight was a reminder of the day he had rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base. He would often think about the decision he had made that day, the risk he had taken, and the consequences that had followed. It had been the right decision, he knew, but it had also been the most difficult one of his life. The pilots who served under Marcus's command knew they were learning from a legend. His reputation for integrity and courage was matched only by his skill as a pilot and his dedication to his personnel. He mentored young officers, sharing not just his technical knowledge but his hard-won wisdom about leadership and moral courage. As Marcus approached retirement, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The 3 years of exile had been the darkest period of his life, but they had also been the most formative. They had taught him the true meaning of integrity, the importance of never giving up, and the power of standing up for what is right. The Air Force that Marcus was leaving was fundamentally different from the one he had joined as a young officer. It was cleaner, more accountable, and more protective of its personnel. The reforms he had helped implement were working, and the culture of corruption that had once flourished was being replaced by a culture of integrity and excellence. On his final flight as an Air Force pilot, Marcus chose to fly the same route he had taken on that fateful day years earlier. As he rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base one last time, he thought about all the young pilots who would follow in his footsteps, all the officers who would serve with integrity because the system now protected them, and all the families who would be spared the pain his own family had endured. The F-22 rolled inverted over the base, and everyone who saw it knew who was in the cockpit. It was Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, a pilot who had changed the Air Force forever, who had shown that courage comes in many forms, and who had proven that sometimes the only way to make things right is to take to the skis and demonstrate what real integrity looks like. As Marcus landed for the final time, he knew that his legacy was secure. The boy who had dreamed of flying had become the man who had shown the world that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The unauthorized flight of the F-22 that rolled inverted over Edwards Air Force Base had changed everything, and the story would be told for generations to come. Marcus Rodriguez had gotten his wings back, but more importantly, he had restored honor to the Air Force and inspired a new generation of officers to serve with integrity. The F-22 had rolled inverted, and the world had learned who was in the cockpit. It was a hero whose courage would be remembered long after the last contrail faded from the desert sky.